4 people, including a couple and their 6-year-old daughter, appear to have vanished off the face of the planet.
Cult leaders, they're charismatic, normally psychopathic too, but very narcissistic.
Simon's teachings, compared to how he actually lived his life, were quite different.
In the vast, sparsely populated expanses of Western Australia, it's not unusual for people to seek solitude. But in 2007, one small reclusive group took that desire for isolation to an unnerving extreme. They left a simple, baffling note, locked their front door for the last time, and seemingly vanished. In July of 2007, a man, a woman, her 6-year-old daughter and a friend disappeared from a remote farmhouse near the small town of Nannup. They left their furniture, their possessions, and a cryptic message for their landlord. Gone to Brazil. But there's no record of them ever using their passports, no evidence they ever boarded a plane, and no sign they ever arrived. No bodies were ever found, no definitive trail was ever discovered. This is the story of how a small group of people seemingly evaporated, leaving behind a mystery that endures to this day. The Setup, a quiet life in Nannup. To understand the disappearance, you have to understand the people involved and the strange, insular world they built. At the centre of this world was a British man in his mid-40s known as Simon Cadwell. To the few locals in Nannup who knew him, he was an eccentric who slept during the day and spent his nights on a computer. But online, he was someone else entirely. Under the pen name C, Cadwell was the author of books like Servers of the Divine Plan and the focal point of a small, internet-based spiritual circle. He preached that the world was nearing the end of what he described as a 75,000-year cycle. He taught that only a select few, those who learned the lessons of the physical plane, would ascend to a higher state of consciousness. It was a message of secret knowledge, and it attracted followers. One of them was a young woman from Victoria named Chantel McDougall. Her mother described her as fun and always joking. Chantel dreamed of being an actress, but at 19 she met Cadwell at a seminar and was instantly captivated. He was 18 years her senior, and while her family found him strange, Chantel was drawn to his worldview. Soon she was under his influence. The outgoing young woman her parents knew began to change, becoming more secretive and closed off. She moved with Cadwell to Western Australia, and her parents felt they had to walk on eggshells, afraid that asking too many questions would mean being cut off completely. In 2001, Chantel gave birth to a daughter, Leela. By all accounts, she was a devoted mother whose world revolved around her little girl. By 2004, the small family, Simon, Chantel, and Leela, had settled on a rented farmhouse property on the outskirts of Nannup. Their life was isolated. Cadwell's eccentricities grew. He became convinced that electromagnetic waves were being diverted toward their home as part of a conspiracy. Joining them on the property was Tony Poppich. A 40-year-old from a nearby town, Tony was a close friend of Chantel's. While some friends described Chantel's relationship with Cadwell as lacking warmth, as if she were brainwashed, her bond with Tony was one of genuine friendship. He lived in a caravan on their land and was part of this strange, secluded family unit. In effect, they had become a tiny, self-contained group bound by a shared belief system, what some might call a cult of 4. The inciting incident. The vanishing. The last confirmed sighting of the group was on July 13th, 2007. Chantel, Simon, Leela and Tony drove to the town of Busselton, where they sold Chantel's car for $4,000. After the money was transferred into her bank account, all 4 of them got into a waiting vehicle and were driven away. They were never seen again. Because of their isolation, weeks went by before anyone noticed they were gone. It wasn't until their landlord came to check on the property that the first sign of anything wrong was discovered. The house was clean, but some accounts mentioned that food had been left in the fridge. On the front door was a short note, "Gone to Brazil." At first, this might not have seemed completely sinister. Chantel had told her mother that the group planned to go to Brazil to help people. In the weeks before they vanished, Cadwell had told his online followers a similar story, that they were moving to join a religious community in Rio Branco. But as the days turned into weeks, the story started to fall apart. A family friend who was a police officer grew concerned and started making inquiries. What he found was chilling. The $4,000 from the car sale sat untouched in Chantel's bank account. There was no record of Chantel, Simon, Leela or Tony using their passports or booking flights under their own names. There was no evidence they ever set foot in Brazil. The investigation, a trail of unanswered questions. Once the official police investigation began, a disturbing and complex picture started to emerge. The house in Nannup, though tidy, offered clues that only deepened the mystery. Most of their possessions, including furniture, had been left behind. In Tony Poppich's caravan, another note was found telling the landlords they could simply keep the caravan. It was as if the group intended to shed every last piece of their former lives. The investigation quickly centered on Simon Cadwell, and the deeper police dug, the more they realized that his entire identity was a lie. Simon Cadwell was not his real name. He was born Gary Felton in the UK and had stolen the name from a former colleague years earlier. This wasn't just a man with eccentric beliefs. This was a man actively hiding his past under a fabricated identity. The focus on Felton revealed a pattern of control. Investigators learned that he dictated what Chantel's parents could say to their own granddaughter for fear they would poison her mind. Friends described Chantel as being completely subservient to his will. The financial picture was just as baffling. The untouched $4,000 was a major red flag. If they planned a new life in Brazil, why leave it behind? Police also discovered that shortly before the disappearance, Tony Poppich's father had given him $25,000 for what Tony claimed was a legal matter. That money was never accounted for. Every lead the police pursued seemed to dissolve into a paradox. The note said Brazil, but their passports were unused. They sold a car for money but left the cash behind. These weren't the actions of a family going on a planned trip. They suggested people in a frantic hurry, or people sending a deliberately confusing message. Chantel's mother, Catherine, recalled a disturbing detail from her last visit. A passport for 6-year-old Leela had arrived in the mail, but Chantel was evasive when asked about it. In hindsight, Catherine said she knew in her gut that something was wrong. For years, police chased sightings and theories, but the trail always went cold, leaving behind nothing but questions. The official investigation left police with a collection of contradictory clues and a case that grew colder with each passing year. It's a mystery with no easy answers, which forces us to look at the various theories that have emerged. Before we dive into what might have happened to the Nannup 4, if you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing for more deep dives into unexplained mysteries. Now, let's explore the possibilities. The theories. What happened to the Nannup 4? When people vanish, investigators typically look at 3 possibilities. They left willingly, they met with foul play, or they took their own lives. In this case, elements of all 3 theories are present, which is exactly why the mystery is so hard to solve. Theory number 1. They left willingly and started a new life. This is the simplest theory, suggested by the note itself. The group wanted to disappear, and they succeeded. In this version of events, Brazil was a deliberate misdirection. Using the $25,000 from Tony Poppich's father, they could have created new identities and assimilated into some other remote community, living off the grid. The clean house and abandoned possessions seem to support this. It speaks to a conscious effort to sever ties with their past. Gary Felton, already living under a stolen identity, certainly had the mindset to orchestrate such a plan. However, this theory has significant holes. Disappearing completely, especially with a child, is incredibly difficult. For over a decade and a half, has not one of them made a single mistake. Chantel was very close to her parents, despite Felton's influence. Could she truly maintain complete silence, knowing the pain her family was in? And what about Leela? She would be a grown woman now. The level of discipline required for 4 people to maintain such a secret is immense. Theory number 2, murder-suicide or a group suicide pact. This is the darkest, and unfortunately, a very plausible theory. It's a tragic scenario that calls to mind other groups like those at Jonestown or Heaven's Gate. Felton's teachings about ascending to a higher plane are chillingly similar to the rhetoric used by other leaders who led their followers to their deaths. The coroner who presided over the inquest acknowledged that group suicide was a serious possibility. Perhaps Felton, who was reportedly despondent in the weeks leading up to the vanishing, decided it was time to ascend. and convinced Chantel and Tony to join him. The Brazil note could have been a final deception meant to buy them time. They could have driven to a remote part of the Western Australian bush, a place so vast their remains might never be found. However, the coroner also noted a key piece of counter-evidence. For a man like Gary Felton, described by some as a narcissist who built a persona as a guru, death would have been the ultimate message. The coroner found it strange that he wouldn't leave behind a final sermon or manifesto. The quiet, ambiguous nature of the disappearance doesn't quite fit the profile of a grand apocalyptic exit. Theory number 3: foul play. The third theory is that the group was murdered. Perhaps they crossed paths with a more dangerous individual or group. Or maybe the conflict was internal. Some have speculated that the perpetrator was Gary Felton himself. Could he have murdered Chantel, Leela and Tony and then disappeared alone? The money from Tony's father could have been a motive. In this scenario, he would have killed them, buried their bodies and then used the money to create yet another new identity for himself. This theory explains the suddenness and secrecy, but it lacks hard evidence. There was no sign of a struggle at the property and no bodies have ever been found. While Felton was controlling, there was little in his past to suggest he was capable of such violence. Like the other theories, it's a narrative built on speculation rather than fact. Conclusion: the lingering mystery. In 2018, more than a decade after they vanished, a coroner's inquest officially concluded, leaving the case in a state of unsettling limbo. The coroner found that while it was possible they had died, there was not enough evidence to prove it. Officially, the case of Chantel McDougall, Leela McDougall, Tony Popish and Gary Felton remains that of missing persons. Their fate is undetermined. And so, the questions remain. Did a man who stole his own identity successfully orchestrate the disappearance of 3 others into a new hidden life? Did a doomsday prophecy lead them to a planned death in the wilderness? Or did a leader's control curdle into something far more violent? The house in Nannup has long since been rented to others. The world has moved on. But for the family left behind, especially Chantel's parents, the nightmare is unending. A state of not knowing where hope and grief are in constant battle. As her mother Catherine said, "Someone has to know what happened. I need answers." The case of the Nannup 4 is a chilling reminder of how belief can isolate, how control can be mistaken for enlightenment, and how, even in our modern world, it's still possible for people to step out of their lives and vanish without a trace. What do you think happened? Let me know your theories in the comments below.